Hello, everyone. Welcome to Animal Think Tank's October webinar. I'm going to jump right in and introduce Aidan, who's our guest speaker today. We're really happy to have him speak with us today. He's the mission lead at an organisation in the US called Pax Fauna, and they have a really similar goal to Narrative at ATT in that they conduct research to sort of work out the best ways for animal advocates to organise and communicate with the public. And they're, like us, sort of also using that research to develop persuasive stories about animal freedom. Aidan's going to be taking us through some of that research today. And they're actually going to be running a few pilot campaigns in Denver, Colorado, based on what we'll be talking about today. So that's super exciting. It'll be we're also hoping to have a little bit of Q&A. So if anybody watching has any questions, please just put them in the chat, and then we'll put them to Aidan at the end, if that works for you, Aidan. Yep, great. Then I'll hand over to you.
All right, thanks, Beth, and thanks a lot to Animal Think Tank for having me on, and thanks for everyone for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces, so really excited. Just going to apologize in advance if my voice is a little quiet. I'm feeling a bit under the weather, so if I start to mumble or speak quietly, just like let me know in the chat and remind me to speak up a little bit. And without further ado, I'll jump in. So, as Beth mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some narrative research that Pax Fauna has been doing over the last about 2.5 years that we've been around. And I'm going to be zooming in on one kind of particular dynamic that we've found in a lot of focus group and interview research. So primarily qualitative research, although I'll talk about the particular aspect that I want to focus on today has also become sort of a theme in some large scale RCTs that we've been conducting as a follow-on to a lot of the qualitative research, which is basically around emotion. So, well, I'll frame it up in a second, but just give a little more background. Pax Fauna is, as Beth said, we're an organization in the US trying to use research to rethink the grant strategy specifically for the grassroots side of the animal freedom movement. So a lot of our focus has been on thinking about messaging and how can we communicate with the public in a way that they actually understand. But we've also been looking at new strategies that especially actually a lot of that came out of the messaging research is sort of new ways of thinking about where do we need to meet the public, not just what are we saying, but where do we need to meet them for them to hear the message that we're trying to give? And then also thinking about just internal organizing systems for activists, something most of us our founding group at least came out of Direct Action Everywhere. So we have a sort of our DNA is in the grassroots side of things. And so that's a little bit about who we are. Let me just jump right into, so as I mentioned, we over about 2-year period conducted a major study involving tons of interviews and about 200 hours worth of interviews and focus groups with about 200 just normal mediating members of the American public. And all of that was kind of inspired by this interesting tension we were noticing in some survey data that was coming out in the last decade, which seemed to suggest that on the one hand, a large number of people support something like animal freedom in principle, at least, like 32% of people saying in a Gallup poll that animals should have the same rights as humans to be protected from harm and exploitation, or in different surveys, near majorities saying they would support a slaughterhouse ban, or as many as 33% saying they would support a total ban on animal farming, which is obviously more people than we might think as animal activists. And so there is the other side of that. In those same samples, you get people saying 97% of people agreeing with the statement whether to be vegetarian or not is a personal choice and no one can tell me what to do. And to back that up with kind of real world observational data, that there seems to have been no apparent real increase in vegetarianism in the United States over the last kind of 2 decades. So like I said, as animal activists, this is like seems like a real contradiction. And we set out to kind of try to square the circle and understand what's going on in people's minds when they give when the same person who, is going to, at least 27% of people in, some of these samples are saying both, yeah, but whether to be vegetarian is a personal choice, no one should tell me what to do, but also like society, we should stop animal farming completely. So we wanted to bring people into an interview setting and just try to draw them out on that and actually understand, what are they thinking when they say those things. And we were sort of armed with the idea that probably what's going on has to do with framing. So framing there's a whole literature on this idea that it's like cognitive patterns and language, and it's actually, so it's patterns and language. Framing has to do with patterns and language, but it's also reflected in real cognitive structures in our brains. And so different language activates like different parts of our brains and causes us to view things through a different lens. So that's, the idea of a frame. It's like what does it put in focus and what does it keep out of focus? And so the same person talking through using different language will focus on different things. So obvious classic example of a frame is glass half empty versus glass half full. But there are more subtle ways that framing can kind of influence our decision making. So if frozen yogurt is marketed and it says 80% fat free, that sounds maybe like pretty different than 20% fat. Or maybe even more mysteriously, if a laptop is being sold, which is going to sell more laptops, saying it's 20% off or $120 off. I'll zoom through that because as I'm going to say, so like I said, this is all coming from a larger piece of research that is available if you want to peruse through a lot of different findings that we had. I'm going to summarize some of the top level before I get into what I specifically want to talk about today. But if you do want to poke around this more, I encourage you to check out narrative.paxfauna.org, a little interactive website that we designed to sort of home your way through some of these findings. And there is also some recordings of like webinars and stuff on there that go into different aspects of it. So to just go on, because today I want to zoom into on something that I haven't talked as much in depth about before. But just to give a quick overview, animal advocates currently spend a lot of our time trying to convince people that animal farming is harmful. So if we think about, different forms of vegan outreach, our main message in these places is, trying to show people footage, trying to give people information about maybe the environmental harms or about the intelligence of animals. And what we found bringing people into a kind of lab setting is that most of the people we talk to are already aware that animal farming is harmful. So they would say things like, we would bring people in, and our first question, which we tried to design to be as neutral as possible, before hoping at this point in the conversation they didn't even know that we were animal advocates or anything like that. We asked this, starting question. So what comes to mind when you think about animals used for food? And almost everyone we've talked to said something like, oh, I feel so sad. I don't like to think about it. It's horrible what happens, da da da. So there's this awareness is already out there, which is good news. A lot of there's always room for more education and information, but a lot of the work that the movement has done over the past few decades has penetrated into the public understanding. So people are aware that there's problems with animal farming, and that's not doing it. But for some reason that's not enough for them to change their behavior in the ways that we maybe would like to hope. So what we kind of, and again, I'm zooming over this kind of quickly to try to get to today's topic, but what we saw was a sort of patterns in how people engage with the topic of the suffering of animals used for food. Thought of it in sort of layers, like layers of sediment that we were kind of boring through in these conversations. So started with avoidance. So one of the most common things we heard people say was, I try not to think about it. I try not to think about what happens, because if I do, then I won't want to eat meat. So, an amazing number of people said something exactly like that. So there's this avoidance layer that they're kind of going through the world with. But in our conversation, with a gentle invitation that didn't come across as judgmental and was less likely to kind of provoke defensiveness, they'd be willing to lean in and consider the topic. And so the next stage we would encounter is this deep ambivalence. So really torn, like ambivalence, not in the sense of not caring, but in the sense of having two really conflicting views. On the one hand, they're very attached to meat and other animal products. but on the other hand, they're upset about what they know it takes to create those products. And so they would dwell in this kind of churning ambivalence for a while. But then they'd start to move to the next layer. They'd start to sort of draw out these justifications or rationalizations to try to resolve that uncomfortable, sometimes we call it cognitive dissonance. And it seemed like these justifications were nothing new. Like they were familiar. People had thought about them before. So these were the things that people had thought through before when they had thought about this topic, whether because they encountered video of slaughterhouse or whatever it was that caused them to think about this in the past. They'd come up with these justifications. And these are things anyone, I'm sure everyone on this call has encountered, not just, things like naturalness. Oh, it's part of our evolution to eat animals and our ancestors have always done it. Or culture, different cultures have important meat dishes and we shouldn't, it's not okay for us to say that that's wrong or to try to take that away from cultures. Or health, I just don't think I can get a nutritious diet without eating meat. But a lot of these justifications, again, in this interview setting where the interviewer was kind of trying not to show their own feelings about it, but just asking open-ended questions, people could kind of talk themselves through some of these justifications. So they would, if they brought up the naturalness thing, say, oh, it's part of our evolution and we've always done it. They'd hear themselves say that and they'd say, well, that's not a really good, that's not sound logic. That's not a good enough reason for me to, go against something that kind of so obviously goes against my values, what's happening to animals. And a lot of those justifications were like that. They were kind of insecure. People weren't super confident about them, or maybe just by themselves, they could kind of think through why that maybe wasn't a great reason. But one justification, or maybe, stood out and was so consistent and so difficult for people to overcome that we kind of give it its own category. And often it would be sort of the end of the conversation, which is futility. So as people would get to talk through these justifications, they would find this idea that, you know what, though, it doesn't matter what I do. Even if I went vegan, there's 7 billion other people who aren't. The world's never going to change. Meat has always been here and it always will be here. And so I'm not going to be the one to kind of stick my neck out and take on, this social cost of being vegan and, inconvenience myself because it's not going to make a difference anyway. And often that would be kind of the end of like the productive part of the conversation. At that point, it felt like we couldn't, at first, at least in these interviews, that would be people would be really secure in that futility and just say, okay, doesn't matter. I'm not going to think about it anymore. So if we think about these layers, I think of like in each, if we notice these patterns and kind of how people are talking about the thing, where we want people to be is that ambivalence, right? We want people to be processing these emotions that they have about the topic, and we want to invite them to lean into those emotions. And all these other, kind of frames or views that they might be looking through are counterproductive for us, or we're trying to get them back to that emotional ambivalence. So whatever stage we're in, we're thinking, how can I okay, if it's an avoidance, what do I need to do to get them to think about it? And maybe the answer is, non-judgmental invitation. And then they get to ambivalence. But if they move past that and they go into justifications, we're hearing those familiar justifications. What can we do about that? And I'm gonna, I'll save that. You can definitely encourage you to poke around on the website and stuff. And then futility is how to get out of the futility is a big focus of our research. And just to very quickly say, what we think is the most important thing to escape that futility trap is shifting our engagement with the public from what we call a consumer frame to a civic frame. So people are used to thinking about food and their food choices as consumers. The extent of their thinking about food is themselves going to the grocery store, going to a restaurant, making choices there. They don't really picture the system beyond that. And that creates a lot of futility. That's very closely attached to this futility. Like I said before, they're thinking of it in terms of, well, if I just go vegan, there's 7 billion other people who won't. And so it doesn't matter what I do. So this frame presents that problem for us of futility. People don't feel like they have the power to make change as individual consumers. the challenge for us as advocates is, can we shift that engagement into a civic frame, where instead of being a conversation about consumer choices like veganism, the topic of animal rights is a conversation about political issues, maybe political movements, how they vote rather than what they buy at the store. And this is not just a messaging problem, as I kind of alluded to in the very beginning. It's also a strategic problem. It's not enough to say, if we say go into a grocery store or a restaurant and do a disruption and we say we're asking for, civic change, we're asking people to change the way they vote. People aren't going to really believe us because, well, why are you disrupting me in a restaurant where I'm not engaged in voting right now? I'm engaged in purchasing food. I'm engaged in my role as a consumer. So how can we as a movement figure out how to meet the public when they're wearing their civic hat? And one way to do that is as voters, but finding other ways, I think, is one of the big challenges that I'm interested in right now. How can we meet the public when they're kind of engaged in as a civic role? Okay. So with that kind of overview aside, we're gonna zoom in on what I want to talk about today, which is really this emotional thing, and that this world of emotions and this kind of emotional paradox, and I'm going to describe in a second, really lives in this avoidance and ambivalence stage. It's about getting people from avoidance to ambivalence, and also about how people are going to process that ambivalence as constructively. And maybe there's even some hope if we can really become skillful at messaging about emotions, and I think everything I'm going to be talking about so far and ongoing in this short presentation applies both to, one-on-one conversations, outreach, and also to like mass messaging, say if you're, putting up a billboard or whatever it is. In both contexts, this is about how we get people from avoidance into that ambivalence, invite them into that emotional conflict that they have, and also help them process it constructively, maybe in a way where they aren't even going to have to jump over to justification, because they can just, constructively work through this ambivalence right away. So that's the hope, that's the goal. And the challenge that arises with that is this real paradox about emotion in animal advocacy messaging. So the problem here is, on the one hand, decide which hand to describe first. One of the most common things that we heard in our focus group and kind of interview research as a reaction to animal advocate messages was that this message is emotionally manipulative. So people described, even showing slaughterhouse footage, like if we think about, cubes and things like that, or even just sharing it on social media. We weren't showing slaughterhouse footage in our interviews and focus groups, but yeah, a lot of different messages that we tested. One of the main kind of reactions that we heard from our focus group participants was that, oh, that's like that's people trying to emotionally manipulate me. People would say, I want messages based on facts. Just give me the facts. Don't, try to play with my emotions. But then if we actually tried that, if we actually just gave facts, like, it's totally boring. It's totally falsified. This issue is fundamentally, I mean, it's a very emotional issue. And we need to make an emotional connection with the public for anyone to care about what we're saying. If we did without without pointing to the emotional aspect of this topic, we're going to get ignored. So how do we weave through this challenge? I'm going to make a few recommendations. Oh, here was my thing. So people say they prefer fact-based messages and they don't want to be emotionally manipulated, but in practice, without an emotional connection, people are just going to ignore the topic. So I have a few strategies that came out of our focus groups, and then I want to explore how this has continued to be really a strong theme in some large-scale randomized controlled trials that we've done with messaging, that this kind of, some of these strategies for emotional appeals have just become the strongest standalone messages that we've identified. So, and again, all of these are things that we can do either in individual outreach or in at a messaging scale. So first kind of strategy I'll suggest is leaving a lot of room for the listener. And the main thing about this is sort of really an invitation to use questions rather than statements. But it starts with just toning down our emotional language. So yes, if going in and knowing that, I mean, as I think something I could have even mentioned earlier, like defensiveness. We've all encountered so much defensiveness when we're either doing outreach or thinking about messaging. This is one of the main challenges for animal activists. And this thing about it being emotionally manipulative is one manifestation of that defensiveness. So one thing we just know is that if so many members of the public are kind of perceiving us as hysterical almost, or as histrionic, these are like words that came out in our focus groups, overly emotional, we can tone down the emotional intensity of our language without, like, we can trust that just there's to some extent, just describing what's happening has the emotional relevance. Like it's going to, like, we can trust that just describing what's happening in sort of simpler language without a lot of adverbs is going to get the point across. And then we can think, going a step beyond that, can we try to form messages as questions? So this is an example. This is the way that we were testing some messages in focus groups. It was like meant to emulate sort of a social media ad that people might see. And it's talking about a hypothetical ballot measure issue that people might be voting on. And this was a message that went through a couple of iterations. So I'll just read it for a second. Whatever the industry might claim, I don't think anybody with a heart in their chest can watch the videos from slaughterhouses and not feel disgusted. Animals deserve freedom from slaughter. We focus on our freedom, but what about theirs? The first version of this message ended with animals deserve freedom from slaughter, this was years ago, so I used to be able to say this off the cuff, but it didn't end with a question. And so this is a pretty strong emotional message, right? Having just said this thing about, people perceive this as perceive us as sort of overly emotional. This message is overtly about emotions. And the first version of this message didn't go over very well. It definitely encountered that kind of objection. But when the change that made this message pretty successful, one change that made this message pretty successful was adding this rhetorical question at the end. And it's a pretty obviously rhetorical question, right? It's not, and it's pretty clear what the speaker thinks the answer to that question should be. But it's still, we found that to be really effective as an invitation to the reader or the listener to put themselves in the situation and let them connect the dots. And it just, using questions helps people feel like, rather than like I'm being lectured at, I'm involved in this and I'm reaching my own conclusions. So that's one strategy. Another is to let pictures make that emotional connection. And again, this goes with kind of toning down our emotional language. Can we rely on pictures to create the emotional connection and then use language that's not going to come across as manipulative? With the caveat that, as I said, even images can be seen by a lot of the people we were talking to as manipulative. So showing footage of slaughter at the most extreme moments, that was seen as manipulative. On the other hand, encouraging, finding was that just pictures of cute animals. I mean, so I think the next, there's another message that we tested that was just this exact picture of this adorable little cow with his tongue sticking out. And it just paired with a message, something like, we want to live, or we don't want to be killed. We didn't need, that message was really melted through the defenses of the people that we in our focus groups. So they, where it is essentially something to the, like, we don't need to rely on slaughter image. These images of animals thriving can get the point across. People, in response to that footage, it wasn't just like, oh, he's so cute. It was like, oh, I can't argue with that. That's a really, they're right. I shouldn't, they don't want to die. So that's one thing. And the other kind of image that we recommend using. So if slaughter images are kind of too intense for a lot of people, bring up that defensiveness really strongly, are seen as manipulative, there's this other kind of image that doesn't have that same reaction, which is sort of post-slaughter images where an animal's body is partway between like meat as it looks packaged on a grocery store shelf and a living animal. And it doesn't have that immediate, feeling that it's like shock value or something. So it feels more kind of factual, but it makes that connection, which so many people are, like we said, trying to avoid thinking about the connection between animals and meat. So as an example on this next slide, I'm going to show one. It's, it is a little graphic. this is, so this brings up disgust, which is something that we talk more about. And like I said, I encourage check out on the website I flashed earlier. Disgust is a powerful tool for us to use. And there's a close link between kind of moral disgust and like just visceral physical disgust, which this is kind of image brings up even for people who do eat meat, because it's halfway between the meat product and the animal. And then the last strategy that I want to sort of I'm going to focus on for the rest of my time and talk about some RCTs that have examined this is just explicitly appealing to emotion. So if a common reaction to a message, that's using a lot, like, give an example what I mean when I'm talking about like adverbs, something like animals in factory farms, are subjected to horrific torture. These factory farms are concentration camps and, torture chambers, and, using all these like really charged words that are meant to appeal to emotion brings up this response of emotional manipulation or hysterical or overly emotional. A different strategy is so if that's like an implicit appeal to emotion, this strategy is an explicit appeal to emotion. So the quote, and I have to say this is not an actual quote from James Cromwell. We were experimenting with different messengers, so we tried attributing it to a famous actor that people might recognize. But the quote itself: if you have an emotional reaction to seeing footage of animals suffering inside slaughterhouses, that's a good sign that you're a human being. Feeling anguish about what these animals go through, that's useful information. We should listen to that. So this is explicitly inviting people into that emotion and saying, so this brings up this going back to the idea of framing. This is an idea that people are familiar with. They've probably encountered in the world that, hey, actually emotions are good. Like, and those are important things. It's a whole person is someone who's in touch with their emotions and can, listen to them without being controlled by them. But so bringing up that frame this is a really effective counter to that. Oh, don't try to manipulate my emotions thing. It's saying, no, these are your emotional reaction to this footage. I'm not telling you what emotions to have. I'm just saying your emotional reaction. That's something we should listen to. And most people, of course, have the same emotional reaction to seeing this footage. So this was in our focus groups, qualitative research. This was a really effective message. But it's really actually risen to the top. This was one of many different rhetorical strategies that we came out of our focus groups recommending. And I suggest you check them out on the website. But in some RCTs that we've done since then, that this sort of explicit emotional appeal has really risen to the top of the pile. So we've been working with a very cool firm called Rhetorical, which is a small just group of guys who are helping particularly animal advocates design large-scale messaging studies with a really interesting method. And so what their approach is they ask, first we do a small study where we just ask a bunch of members of the public to write the message that they think would be most effective for a particular outcome. So in this case, we were measuring the effect of messages on support for a slaughterhouse ban as a ballot measure at the statewide level in the US, because that's something that we're sort of pursuing. We're currently pursuing a slaughterhouse ban at the city level in Denver, Colorado. But that's something we could do at the state level as well. And so that was kind of the proxy we were using as just general support for pro-animal policies. So we asked a bunch of members of the public to write messages themselves. What do they think would be the strongest message? And in a lot of different kind of prior research, we've seen that the best crowdsourced messages often outperform the best expert messages. And this makes sense going back to this. A lot of what our point was in the focus groups was figure out, how are ordinary people thinking about this? And so a lot of our messages, like the ones that I flashed before, actually, these two messages were kind of partly cobbled together by things that people were saying in our own focus groups, because we thought that sort of lay person, how lay people are thinking about this would be a great way to create messages that really resonate with people. So, and that definitely held true in that thing before about like crowdsourced messages outperforming a lot of expert messages. So in an initial version of this experiment, we included a lot of messages from different animal advocate groups, like using their kind of press releases or websites or social media ads and things to create messages that are representative of current messaging strategies in the movement. And then we mixed that with messaging strategies that were coming out of our qualitative research, as well as messages that were just directly crowdsourced in this RCT. And so then we go from that initial batch of crowdsourced messages to a large scale RCT where we test all those messages against each other. And this was the second round of that. So we'd already, we'd do that first RCT, we'd winnowed out a bunch of, we'd taken basically the top performers and then went again into a second round where we showed those top performers to members of the public and said, given that these messages have done well in the past, now again, write a message that you think will be good. And the listen to your emotions message was one of the strongest messages in the whole out of these two rounds. So if the control was, 52% support for the slaughterhouse ban, this one clocked about 56.7, or no, what is that? 57.2% for the support. But all the messages above this were overtly welfarist. So it's true that in a short, immediate sense of in this very limited context of an RCT, where people are just shown a message and then asked, how they would support a measure. The most popular messages were people's familiar way of thinking about this, which is, there's a better way to do this. Slaughterhouses, instead of slaughterhouses, we should rely on local family farms. And not only is that maybe not the message that we're trying to deliver, it's also just factually inaccurate. We would still have slaughterhouses if we had local family farms. Okay. So what's really exciting about this listen to your emotions message is the top performing message that kind of feels like it's a fit with the values of the animal rights movement and, is also kind of factually accurate in terms of the issue that we're talking about. Okay. I think that's, yeah. So this is to flash that again. This is the version that we now are testing in the RCTs. If you have an emotional reaction to seeing footage of animals suffering inside slaughterhouses, that's a good sign that you're a human being. Feeling anguish about what these animals go through, that's useful information. We should listen to that. This initiative is on the right side of history. So just explicitly inviting people into that emotion, it seems to be very powerful. Okay, so we're going to pause and just have time for, I think, hopefully a bit of a longer Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Aidan. We have a question from Chetan. Do you have any studies related to the property status of animals?
One thing we definitely were interested in the qualitative research was the current paradigms in animal advocate messaging. We sort of, we're all very familiar with this conflict between welfarist versus rights messaging, welfare versus rights messaging. So welfare messaging, I don't need to explain that for everyone on this call. We found that neither the welfare paradigm as we know it or the rights paradigm reflects how the general public thinks about this issue, and they're both pretty impenetrable to people. So on the one hand, welfare messaging is pretty which is not to say that welfare campaigns aren't useful or that there's not a good place for them. But when we're thinking about how we're engaging with the public, messages about welfare or information about welfare was pretty uninspiring. So we saw things like, people saying cage free. A lot of people are skeptical of some of those minor welfare reforms. Certainly when they're provided with information about what those reforms mean, the response is like, well, why would I get off my ass and vote for something like that's just so trivial. Why would I it's not worth my attention. On the other, so we might as advocates think that those campaigns are worthwhile, but for the public, it's not the best kind of angle we can use. On the other hand, rights messaging literally does cause a lot of people to think, what does that mean? There's going to be elephants voting or in courtrooms, representing it's a very alien way for people to think about that. So the personhood or the property status thing, my sense coming out of that is it takes so much explaining of why that's kind of the important thing for us. There might be a setting where we are trying to educate the public about what property status versus personhood even means before we're then saying why it's a problem that animals have property status instead of personhood and make the case. That's such a long information dense argument to make there might be a time that we're trying to make that in a lot of situations as advocates, we don't have that much time with people. And my suggestion would be that the property status kind of angle is not going to connect with people very easily when we don't have all the time to sort of convey that whole. Does that kind of get it, the question?
We're leaving participants muted for
Okay, for good
obvious
reasons.
reasons.
Okay.
But if I see anything in the chat, I'll
Okay.
shout it out. We have a question from Jesper.
Yeah,
So,
okay. I see Jasper's questions.
so straight facts didn't do well, but there are some types of facts that did better than others.
Yes, so facts were important. I definitely recommend including facts in your message. We also need to make that like without emotion, facts aren't interesting. But facts definitely one of our top findings is, including a fact in every message definitely strengthens every message. And I love the way you ask the question. Are there some types of facts that did better than others? Numerical facts. So I think what including a fact does in your message, the most important thing that it's doing is basically providing a kind of authority to what you're saying. So the best way, like in most cases, people don't have enough information. So we know that the facts about animal agriculture are very damning, but most members of the public don't have enough context around these issues to contextualize those facts in a meaningful way. So for instance, about climate change, if we're saying animal agriculture is, 14.5% of greenhouse gases or whatever other number it is, for most people who aren't like steeped in the topic of climate change, that's the number itself is not actually very meaningful. But providing a number, just having a number, makes you sound a lot more trustworthy and authoritative. So you're showing that you've done your research, and people value that a lot, even if that's what they'll not exactly what they'll say on the surface. So a numerical fact is very strong, and within numbers, I would recommend leaning on the conservative side of any range of numbers. So if there's debate about what percentage of GHGs are caused by animal agriculture, leaning on the conservative side, meaning like the lower end estimate, trust that even 14.5% it seems very substantial to people. That's what we found. And on the other hand, if you err on the high side and then later hear something contradicting that will kind of undermine your credibility. So it's go on the safe side, trust that those numbers are good enough, and then provide a citation. So the strongest types of facts: numbers on maybe the low end of the spectrum, and then provide a citation. And again, in whatever different messaging context you're talking about, people probably aren't going to go look it up, but you giving them the chance to look it up, makes them feel like you're engaging with them, as more respectfully, like you're respecting their kind of intellectual capacities to say, oh, well, this study done by Harvard and this year or whatever, where you're giving them enough information that they can go fact check it, provides you with your message with a lot of authority. And I would just challenge, yeah, absolutely, in every like even in messages that are just about the intelligence of animals, or that don't seem like things that are kind of messages that are more about emotion than fact. I mean, so for instance, with the emotion response message, we're now in practice when we're using that, we're pairing it with a fact about what percentage of Americans agree with that. Or like in our case, we did a poll in Denver, and so it's 84% of Denver voters agree that animals under human care shouldn't be subject to violence and exploitation, or whatever. I think something like that. So just being able to include a numerical fact in any message, even if it's not a message you normally think of as like a fact-based message or sort of data-based argument, definitely recommend that.
Thanks, Aidan. Had a question from Katie. She says, thanks for the great presentation. Could you expand on shifting to a civic framework and how to combat futility related specifically to like civic engagement? So the idea that a single vote doesn't matter.
Yeah, so great question. Certainly a lot of people, I mean, I'm speaking in the US context. There are a lot of people in the US who feel pretty disengaged from politics, feel like their vote doesn't matter. So it's interesting that we found in these conversations that's so much, I think people felt the key difference, so people did seem to feel much more of a sense of power or ability to influence the world through a civic frame than through a consumer frame. It's true that there are people who feel like their vote doesn't matter, but I think it's much more clear to more people that their consumer choices aren't shaping the world. And I think the key difference is just like people, between these two options, between thinking about your vote and thinking about your vote with your dollar kind of thing. The civic frame is so much more. One reason that it's working is not just that it's providing a pathway to change, like it's, oh yeah, if we vote differently, conceivably this thing could happen. It's also just a role where people think about society as a whole acting rather than individuals. So much of, yeah, when people think about their vote, let me give an example of an issue where people are very used to thinking of it as a policy thing, even though it's in a lot of ways similar problems, is healthcare. So healthcare is a product that people shop around for and buy, just like they shop around for animal products and buy them, or food products and buy them. But people are used to thinking of them in completely different ways. We think of, at least in the United States, we think of healthcare as primary. Well, it's funny because I guess in the UK, healthcare is not a product, right? But here, people think primarily of healthcare as a policy issue. They're totally used to hearing politicians talk about healthcare. They're very used to thinking about the role that government plays, that big corporations and their policy decisions play, and what options are available to me. And that's not how people think about food. They think, oh, I go to the grocery store and there's just endless options and I can choose whatever I want. Mm-hmm. So bringing in that civic frame, one thing it does is just bring in, oh, okay, there's government policy decisions and there's policy decisions of major, like huge corporations are actually shaping the choices that I have available to me, or the choices that I'm more likely to make because of price and things. Just bringing that kind of awareness in, just brings so much more support to the idea that, like, okay, this is a problem that needs to be solved on a social level. And that's a huge step forward. If we encounter kind of civic futility, it's like a new challenge, but it feels like progress to me compared to consumer futility. Now, I'll say specifically in our context, I think something that goes even further, something that about half the states in the US have. I know there's other countries in the world. Switzerland recently did one of these. So citizen-initiated ballot measures are this like direct democracy process that I think really helps with civic futility. People feel a lot like giving people the option, hey, as voters, first you can sign this petition, and then as a voter, if we get enough petitions, it'll be on the ballot, and as a voter, you'll get to vote on it directly on policy. I think the sense of futility around civics is like, hey, whichever party wins, they're all just owned by, rich people, and it doesn't matter. But whereas voting directly on policy, that's what we hear a lot, is like that, exactly that thing of, oh wow, like we as citizens can actually, take control in this way. We can say what we want and make it happen. Unfortunately, that's like a really limited answer. And so actually I think that's the main, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but the main challenge that I am interested in right now is what are other ways besides ballot measures, which are very limited, and where and when we can use them, that we can engage the public in their role as like citizens, voters, rather than as consumers. So any ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Well, I'm actually going to abuse my host's power here and jump the queue with a question. I'm kind of interested in, like, do you think the consumer frame, like the narrative, that narrative like has helped the movement so far, and if it still has a place? And also, like, have you seen any examples of the civic frame, like actually like being used in the movement, like in action?
So, okay, first to the civic frame. I mean, certainly there's press. I'm going to answer the second part of the question first. There's certainly examples going back, where the public encountered the issue of animal rights in the political realm. For instance, Prop 12 in California, which was the big ballot measure in 2018, or before it, Prop 2 in 2008, which, required cage-free for, banned cages for hens and mother pigs, and veal calves. Welfare reform but it was presented in the political space. And, so fundamentally people were thinking about, okay, what kind of policy should the government have about animals used for food? So I think that's an example. And promising about that, this was a modest welfare reform, but it's not like that was happening all over the country or something. It was the first, and it passed by a huge margin, huge percentage of voters, huge majority of voters voted in favor of things like that. So that to me showed one thing that showed is, wow, if I don't remember what the number was, it was more than 60%. I think it was like high 60s are willing to vote for, this reform. What are 50% plus one of people willing to vote for? Because that's the best thing we can get passed, right? And so to me, I think we can get a lot more ambitious with the kind of policies we're asking for the public. But, and other things, I mean, certainly when there's great voters for animals groups in the United States, especially several states on the East Coast, but in other places where groups have used kind of voter block organizing to say, hey, I've got all these voters in your district on my mailing list who've told me that they want to vote for candidates who support animals. And so if you pass this policy that I'm proposing, then I'm going to tell all these voters that you were pro-animal and they'll vote for you. But if you don't, I'm going to tell them you weren't, and I'll tell them to vote for your opponent. So that's been another effective way that the kind of civic frame has been used on. I would love to see how can we get the public more involved in this kind of civic advocacy in places where ballot measures aren't possible. But those are like some starting examples. To the first question, is there still room for the consumer frame? I think to start with, I'm inclined to think that there was a point in the history of the movement where, it wouldn't have been possible to imagine, even for activists, much less for members of the general public, the state is going to come in and use state power to transition society away from farming animals. So at that point, thinking about, well, what can we do as individuals? We can start this way, I think probably was like absolutely necessary. Is there still room for it? I think there probably is. I'm not quite ready to say that there's no place to be talking to members of the public about their consumer choices. I think we can all, and I'm sure there are probably people who have, already thought this through and are like, whatever, come on, man, I thought this through years ago. But I don't see that there's a credible pathway to, dramatic change for animals in society through like one consumer at a time. But we can think about, okay, if that's not true, what do we need, vegans for? Vegans are acting as like a vanguard group that are demonstrating that this kind of change is possible, and a proof of concept of the kind of world that we're advocating for. And more vegans makes that proof of concept more compelling, even though we don't think that it's the ultimate way that we're going to change is going from 5 to 10 to just this gradual increase in the number of vegans through individual education. We can still think that using individual education right now to increase the number of vegans strengthens this kind of vanguard concept. That's kind of what I'm playing with right now, but that's, I don't feel super like I have a great answer to that.
Fair enough. May not, but thank you very much. I'm going to combine two questions now, kind of on the same theme, from James and Beth. So James has asked, so he's wondering about how people's emotions about the suffering of animals competes against their emotional attachment to events or festivals that involve eating animals. So, how much does the suffering of the turkey weigh up against the tradition of having a turkey at Thanksgiving or Christmas? And then Beth, sort of in the same vein, said, like, what messaging would you recommend around eating turkeys at Thanksgiving or not, as the case may be?
Okay, I'm going to qualify this by saying this is just like my thought in this moment in response to this question. And not only something I haven't thought a lot about, but also something that it's not like, I'm not saying I have the backing of a bunch of research to the claim that I'm about to make, but you're asking me. So my inclination is to think that, Thanksgiving is probably not the most fertile ground for us to be advocating to people on. It's like that's like the hard, that's like that's just like the hardest place we can be going is, hey, like don't eat a turkey on Thanksgiving. Yeah, the culture stuff is very strong. These objections and justifications based on culture and tradition are very strong. I think there's a lot of people who are probably willing to say, yeah, I'll, dramatically cut back on meat uh, uh, all the time except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Or, hey, um I'm willing to like support some pretty transformational kind of policy shifts that are going to set us on a course towards ending animal farming. But in the meantime, I'm definitely going to eat turkey on Thanksgiving, and I'm not even really interested in you telling, So that's kind of the world I'm in. Is like I see that there's all this latent support in the public that we are failing to tap into, and I don't think that the pathway to that is through like Thanksgiving. So I'm personally planning to not really. I'm just going to let that go. And it's like, okay, I mean, a lot of turkeys are killed on Thanksgiving, are killed to be eaten on Thanksgiving, but a lot of animals are killed to be eaten every. I mean, I'm not sure that it's like dramatically different than the number of chickens that are killed to be eaten every day or something. So I don't know. Maybe that's a cop out.
I don't think so. I think it was an interesting answer. I'll, I'll start to think about sort of winding the questions down now, as we've only got 5 minutes before the end of the session. So I'll just throw in one from James and see how far we get. So James says, I'd be interested in doing some focus groups, A/B testing, or even RCT with WTF groups, using different messaging, civic frameworks, etc., and messaging the impact using the data we already collect. So James is essentially interested if the current suggestions are based heavily on a US context, or is there a strong basis that they work in other places as well?
So definitely we were very conscious as we were doing this research. So we were only using a US population. I might have to sneeze in a second here. Sorry. I think there are some things that probably apply well to, at least like I'm pretty confident that what we're talking about would work in, close cultural Anglophone countries to the US, like Canada and the UK. I think most of what we're talking about would work in those situations. So I have a friend who has done some qualitative research in Asia, and specifically with a focus in China with the Good Growth Crow. If anyone's heard of them, they're doing great work. Shout them out. And talking to her about what they've sort of encountered in China, I'm suspecting that it doesn't translate very well. So like some key differences, and I know very little about like the Indonesian context, James, or obviously I know you're concerned with like worldwide organizing. So one thing is that in a lot of places, like in the US, you can think of it in terms of like stages of progress that we're at. Yeah, I mentioned in the US, most people we talked to have already seen footage of slaughterhouses, and they're pretty well aware that like factory farming represents a substantial percentage of food production in the United States. Now we have these survey results that most people think that the meat they buy is humane. I think that those are probably accurate, but it's a pretty small gap to close to say, okay, you're aware that factory farming and industrial slaughterhouses are a major part of how food is produced here in the US. Now here's just a data point from the USDA. 99% of animals live in those contexts raised in the US. So like that's an easier gap to close. Whereas I think in a lot of countries where factory farming is newer or is only currently in process, most people, correctly or incorrectly, don't think that factory farming is the main way that food is produced, or even significantly common in their country. A lot of people, so like for instance, the China context I mentioned, they found that the most receptive age group to like animal welfare messages were older people. And they found that was true because older people mostly have lived, like most people of that generation in China actually have lived on farms or have lived in villages where maybe they don't anymore, but as kids they lived around farms and saw non-factory farms. And so that just presents different challenges. So I think some of this I think it's there's things that will and won't translate, and I think anyone operating in any particular country will be a better judge of what probably translates from our research than I would.
Thank you very much, Aidan. I'll have to, there's lots more questions, but I'll have to sort of draw it to a close now as we get towards the end of the session. Yeah, thank you very much for that. That was brilliant, despite the few little hiccups that we had. I just want to use this final minute to basically push our next webinar, if that's okay. Yeah, so this is the lovely Rob, and he's in charge of the quantitative side of our narrative research and testing at Animal Think Tank. And next month, he'll be doing a deep dive into the animal freedom movement's narrative history. It should be a really entertaining session, but it's going to be a really important one too, because we think that learning from the past is the best way to empower the present. We don't have a sign-up link for next month's webinar yet, but just keep an eye on Animal Think Tank socials and our Eventbrite page to get information on how to sign up. So thank you very much, everybody. And thanks very much to you, Aidan, as well.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Beth. It's been great.